say goodbye, and I'm tired, and I'm ready to lay down. He won't kiss me no more, don't even conversate. I put his food on the table, and he won't even touch his plate. Even a blind man, even a blind man can see. I can feel it in my soul. My baby's slipping away from me. They say you reap just what you sow, but I really don't want him to go, but I'm tired, and I'm ready to lay down. I can feel it in
everyone. I hope you had a lovely lunch. I particularly enjoyed that meat soup. What was that? It was delicious, so thank you very much to everyone who prepared it. So this is panel 10, and I think this one will be super interesting. Excuse me. Cybersecurity, democracy, and human rights. Could a more human-centric approach to cybersecurity strengthen democracy? And to talk to us about that is our brilliant panel: Maggie Recci, Alp Toker, Valentine Weber, and our moderator is Maya Bielosz. Thank you.
Welcome once again. I would like to start this panel by saying that human rights are at risk with increasing digitalization, especially in the context that we are talking about today, that is rising authoritarianism, and in the times of crisis like pandemics and especially the war in Ukraine. We would like to unpack cybersecurity and to explore to explore actually what are the links and connections between cyber, human rights, democracy, and connectivity. And I will give the floor first to Mr. Weber and ask you to give us maybe more global approach and assessment and to tell us what are the key cyber threats at the moment from a global perspective, and which human rights and freedoms are most threatened today by the use of new technologies, as you are expert on advanced technologies.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you that I can be here. It's great to be here in Belgrade. We, in the past couple of years, we have not only seen a health pandemic, but also a surveillance pandemic. We really saw a proliferation of surveillance technologies across the world. We have seen private actors going into business in really providing the tools to governments. Some of you might know the NSO group, right, which is selling spyware, which was selling spyware. And we could really see here that there is always, in these kind of, a key point that I want to get across today is that surveillance does not only come at the expense of human rights, often, but also at the expense of cybersecurity. Because in order to do conduct surveillance, you need to weaken either whether it's encryption. You need to, in the case of NSO Group and the Pegasus spyware, you had to had vulnerabilities in people's phones. You had to have vulnerabilities in phones to access WhatsApp of journalists and so on. So you can really see the direct nexus between human rights, surveillance, and cybersecurity as well. But that's not. There's really not only the number of tools has grown or where it's been deployed, but also the different kinds of things. So it's not only spyware. Another key technology is face recognition technology that's really been proliferating in the last couple of years, and it's really a broad number of suppliers which are based also in Europe, in the US, China, Russia. And in this example, we can see, for instance, it was noted often, the Clearview AI. It's an American company. And here, what it does, it has a large database of social media profiles. If you have a social media profile, you're probably in the database of Clearview AI, which the American company. And then if law enforcement wants to use it, this algorithm by Clearview AI, they use that database to, for instance, in protests after or during the George Floyd protests, the Black Matters movement in America, they used it in the protests as well to know who was there and who participated in those protests. So it's really across the world, also in Europe. Face recognition is already being used by law enforcement for their criminal databases. And here the key danger is that something called the mission creep. That means that you say that you're going to start using face recognition, let's say only if you have video footage somewhere, and then you have a face, and then you'll run it against your database. And then you'll start using it also maybe for body cams of police officers. You might use it in different contexts. So it's really, you keep on going because it's so powerful, because it's so seductive also for law enforcement agencies. That's really one major danger of facial recognition. Is also a question that we haven't yet solved, and that often police departments haven't said yet what they're going to use it for. Is it for serious crimes? Is it for murders, rapes? Is it maybe for going to use to go after homeless people, right? Who are somewhere maybe in a subway somewhere, or and so it's really not clear today what facial recognition is going to be used for. So we really need here clear boundaries if it's going to be used.
And maybe to add, because you mentioned artificial intelligence and the use in the current war, ongoing war in the Ukraine. Could you tell us maybe what else has changed, what the war actually brought in these terms, and what can we expect in the future, maybe some future trends as well?
Well, Clearview AI was used, I think, by Ukrainian troops also to identify Russian soldiers, and then to say, okay, we have these soldiers. Russian families can know who was perhaps who has died in Ukraine, right? So that created kind of a demand within Russia. But I think the war against Ukraine by Russia has really brought, or will bring to a halt, I think, Russia's surveillance exports. There's also many Russian companies based in St. Petersburg, Moscow, other cities that have sold advanced surveillance technologies to monitor internet traffic. So some of you might be familiar with the SORM surveillance system that measures network traffic inside Russia and surveils it. And so that equipment was often exported across the world to dozens of countries. And I think now that's really coming to a review. If you have a Russian software company selling these tools to your government, I think a lot of governments will now rethink, and so that's going to come under increased scrutiny. Okay,
thank you. Countries of the Western Balkans are building their cybersecurity capacities, and what we have seen recently that many countries are under massive cyber attacks, and that's one part of the story. The other part of the story that organizations such as Amnesty International, but also Citizens Labs actually reported that some governments in the region are using surveillance technologies to surveil citizens, or they're buying very sophisticated spy softwares. Ms. Reti, you're coming from Albania, and in the news we are reading a lot of news concerning the leakages of the different data, and Albania is quite exposed to the cyber attacks. But apart from this, could you tell us maybe what are the most common types of human rights violations in the cyberspace in Albania, and which actors and social groups are the most affected in your country?
Yes, thank you, Maya. In Albania, and also I will touch upon regional trends that we covered in our research. One of the most prevalent forms of violations is online violence. Online violence in the form of hate speech or harassment, and usually these violence targets groups that are actually already targeted in the physical world. Let's call it like that, including here women, ethnic minorities, Roma and Egyptians, LGBTI plus persons, and also migrants. In some earlier panels today, this was also mentioned. In context-specific cases, countries of the so-called Balkan route have seen a rise of hate speech against migrants in certain moments of the past few years. So yeah, the trends are very similar with regards to groups and forms of violations, but also there's some context-specific trends, as I said. Another targeted group are human rights defenders who defend the rights of these groups that I already mentioned. Their personal life is usually attacked to delegitimize their work or their credibility and discourage action. So yeah, and what's a common denominator, let's say, for the region in these cases is the fact that these cases rarely make it through the criminal justice system. They are rarely classified as criminal offenses, and this is due to several reasons: lack of a proper legal framework, lack of proper capacities of institutions, lack of awareness, because these cases are not treated as importantly, are seen as second-hand problems, let's say. So they go unpunished, and they discourage reporting this way, so there is under-reporting as well, and lack of trust. On the other hand, independent institutions are more sensitized and more accessible by the victims, including here ombudspersons or anti-discrimination commissioners, depending how they're called in each country. But then again, they lack technical capacities often, and as we all know, their mandates are quite limited. Another common violation witnessed in the region regards freedom of speech. We've seen with the pandemic emergency situations. In Albania, we had an earthquake that was another emergency situation. We've seen how these have been often used at the expense of free speech. By persecuting or arresting of journalists, shutting down online media for spreading panic or for spreading misinformation, and usually these are critical voices. And yeah, in these cases, unlike cases of online violence that I mentioned, institutional response seems to be swift. So there is some sort of a double standard in treating these different rights. Media have also faced cyber attacks. When reporting on anti-governmental protests, for instance, we've seen cases, but also on important processes like elections. Their pages have been down for days. Another trend is that of the so-called censorship through noise. These paid commentators or automatic accounts that target journalists or media pages aiming to flood the social media in a strategic way, multiplying pro-governmental content and discouraging critical voices as such. And this, as I said, is very, very common in the region. Privacy violations, to go back to the cyber attacks that were mentioned earlier, and also massive leakages of personal data have been witnessed by the region. Health-related data were leaked during COVID in Montenegro. Albania had huge leakages around elections, including voters, personal data, even political preferences, phone numbers, addresses, salaries, license plates, everything out there. And this even before the cyber attacks. So yeah, these have been also in Serbia. There's been cases of leaking personal data of political opponents and using them for political gain. Yeah, in these cases also there is little accountability from authorities, and little is talked about the potential risks, security risks for citizens, but also space for misuse and political misuse of the leaks.
Could you tell us, like, because there is a wide range of violations you mentioned, especially not only targeting critical infrastructure, but actually different social groups. What are the implications of these violations for human rights and democracy?
First of all, I would say shrink civic space by centering these critical voices, be it journalists or activists, through these violations of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Also deepening inequalities, already existing inequalities and underrepresentation of certain social groups and minorities. By spreading disinformation and also even manipulating public opinion, the integrity of important processes can be jeopardized, let's say elections, so that also affects democracy. Participation also, or even access to services in the framework of digitalization of public services, let's say, we see often these processes are pushed forward swiftly without conducting human rights risk assessments beforehand, and without having without evidence-based policy making, basically introducing. In Albania, we have 95% of public services digitalized, but there is no data. Who are those groups who cannot access these online services due to lack of access to internet, lack of digital literacy, let's say. So we don't know, but we still push this sort of decision making forward, and we risk leaving these people out with no access to public services, basically. So yeah, these are some of the implications I can think of, but I'm sure there's plenty of others we cannot imagine.
Okay, thank you. Turn to help. Mr. Tucker, your work focuses on the internet shutdowns and government-imposed restriction on telecommunications. Could you give us, besides like what was previously mentioned, could you give us more examples about that disruptions of connectivity, especially when it comes to different democratic processes such as elections or public gatherings and protests, and what are the actual costs, economic, security, social costs of this internet shutdowns and disruption of different kinds of connectivities?
So in our monitoring, we've found that internet disruptions have a huge impact on communities. We track them around the world. And we've also seen that increasingly these disruptions affect political processes, elections, and they can be caused by a number of reasons, including government-issued orders for the shutting of the internet. In research we did with a cybersecurity firm, Surfshout, we found that 8 out of 10 Africans have been impacted by internet shutdowns in one form or the other. So this is a problem that is particularly prevalent in Africa, but it also happens in Europe, it also happens in Latin America, in Asia, around the world. We've seen that there were some 72 internet shutdowns, so these are targeted internet shutdowns affecting mass populations of people that governments have ordered. And this was in the first half of this year, just to give a concept of how prevalent this practice is. And I think in 2022, this was also the year that we realized there's this huge connection between connectivity and critical infrastructure. So I mean, this was known in the research field and in our communities, but particularly with the attacks on critical infrastructure, I think in Russia, we've seen that these are attacks on human rights. Russia's targeting of civilian infrastructure, networks in Ukraine, that demonstrates that there is no middle ground, there is no way to perceive these as separate factors. We have to look at the human rights situation and the critical infrastructure situation as a whole. This is very much interconnected, and it's also dangerous to kind of set aside human rights as its own space, and it's just something those human rights organizations do. I think it's very much connected with security policy and ground governance when it comes to conflict and democracy itself.
Yeah. You mentioned the conflict, and we mentioned several times the war in Ukraine, and how can you comment about like big tech companies that are going into the war and getting more and more engaged, but also we have seen in the video those informal actors such as the anonymous. Can they actually help to overcome these internet shutdowns, or in a longer run, like private actors, how they influence not only on the course of the war, but actually how will they influence human rights, and how they will influence how cybersecurity will look like in the future? What are your thoughts on this?
So Ukraine has been bombarded by cyber attacks, physically, by the air, and these attacks have obviously impacted infrastructure, connectivity. It's targeted. The intention is to cut off the public and the people. Now, big tech has responded initially reactively when it comes to actually finding a solution. It's a question of finding the right statement, public policy that sets that company in a good light. And there have been this has been done to varying degrees by different actors. For example, Microsoft at the beginning of this conflict was very involved with countering cyber attacks that Ukraine's government uses in infrastructure. When it comes to actually reconnecting communities, things are a bit more complicated. First is, I think, to actually track and to know that this is happening. Now, when a community is disconnected, when it's hit by missile strikes, whether it's in Ukraine or anywhere around the world, that region is disconnected. So the people there can't actually self-report what's going on. This is an element that is very often forgotten when it comes to human rights documentation, even to journalism, and to the kind of reporting that governments do, the cables and wires that let governments know what's going on the ground. So it's been essential to monitor that connectivity and be the voice of people who have been left offline. And when you look at groups like Anonymous, they've been helping get the word out around these incidents, but they've also been involved in crowdsourced counterattacks. So you have, in the cyberspace, where you have communities coming together to try to knock out networks on the other side, so in the Russian space. Now, there's a bit of debate about whether this is a reasonable thing to do, the hackback argument. Is it okay? In some sense, it has become a bit of a free-for-all because, it's war, and it's about finding a meaningful response, and also a way of giving something that people can participate in. So it's not always a great idea to hack back, but that's one of the things that communities have engaged in. If we look more directly at providing connectivity, the US, Europe, and many governments have been looking for ways to reconnect parts of the country that are offline. One technology that has been quite effective is low orbit satellite technology. And of course, Elon Musk's platform, Starlink, has been deployed quite effectively, getting 150,000 people connected. There's also been some controversy around this when you look at some of the unexpected things that have happened in the Twitter sphere, which has also raised questions about how involved companies should be and how much of a dependency there should be on companies when it comes to relying on their infrastructure. But at the moment, that technology is still compelling. It still allows people to communicate. So it's useful. And I think satellite technology will provide a bigger role in years to come in terms of providing human rights for communities that are cut off.
Okay, thank you. Back to Mr. Weber, you mentioned a lot of what are the threats at the global level, and especially in the next period of time. Could you tell us what policy interventions we need in order to make this space more democratic and with more respect towards the human rights?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a great friend of democracy is transparency, and a lot of these surveillance these threats to human rights are often shrouded in secrecy. We've had in the last couple of days a lot of conversations, also bilaterally, over the Safe City project here in Belgrade and other cities. It's difficult to know whether the features, FR features, are turned on, which cameras throughout the city use it. And that, I think, really creates a chilling effect in society. People start to be afraid. They don't know, what those capabilities are of those technologies. And so I think the chilling effect is really the worst, because it impacts freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and all these things. People don't dare anymore to do things. So I think we really, I think what's good there is more transparency. I think another thing is, what was really effective as well is public shaming. We've talked earlier about NSO Group. Citizen Lab, a Canadian advocacy group, did a lot of reports on a certain company that was engaged in dubious sellings of selling it to governments that then use it against journalists. And the public shaming really helped, and NSO Group has stopped our offensive cyber operations now. So I think that's really helpful. Another way is also strategic litigation. It means that if there is a case on facial recognition, you can challenge that in court. If a person was targeted in a wrong way or in an abusive way, you could bring that to court, of course, and then make a strategic case out of it, which means that this case has a repercussion on other similar cases where facial recognition technologies or safe city technologies more broadly are used. And then I think that's how we can mitigate already the technologies that are in place. And then there is other technologies that are really, really dangerous, such as emotion recognition, which purports to know whether someone's happy, when someone's sad or angry. And that's already being sold also by Balkan companies, which have gone into that market, not only by the big suppliers around the world, but also by Balkan companies. And the problem with emotion recognition is that it's not scientifically proven. So it's a snake oil. It's because sometimes you can be happy and you can be anxious at the same time, and it won't know it. But so that's, I think, certain technologies we should ban to kind of keep democracy, to protect democracy, and other technologies we need to regulate more strongly, but also ask for more transparency.
Yeah. Maybe one provocative question, but because before the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, there were like a big tech war between the United States and China. And since you were studying geopolitics of cyberspace, could you tell us maybe more your view on this, and who will win the war?
Sure. So. Yeah, so a large part of the tech war was also about the major Chinese companies that are involved, whether it's Huawei, ZTE, but also Hikvision and Dahua. So that's kind of companies that supply 5G equipment, but also surveillance technologies such as cameras and so on. And so I think it hasn't been proven yet that the U.S. made a national security argument. They said, "Hey, China might use these technologies to, let's say, gather data on citizens in Belgrade, and use it to its advantage." But I think the bigger threat is that Hikvision and Dahua cameras, which do make up around 95% or so of the market share in most countries, but also in Serbia and Montenegro and other regional countries, they are profoundly insecure. So they are really they are cheap, but they have let's say, therefore a bad security, because that's not the priority there. And so I think that's the bigger danger, that it could be the people that or the technology might be targeted by cyber criminals, but also by nation states that are involved in this. So I think that's the bigger danger, that that's quite bad security in this way. And I think one could make an argument here to either, as a government, to ask for higher standards. So there's something called as a government, you're buying a lot of these devices. You buy a lot of cameras, or you buy a lot of these devices, and then you can make an argument. Okay, you need to increase your security, and that's how you increase the security of those suppliers. So that would be maybe a way of, kind of mitigating these kind of threats.
Yeah, thank you. Serbia bought imported Chinese surveillance technologies, but just to remind the audience as well that Serbia and Kosovo signed Washington Agreement in 2020, and that Serbia was committed not to actually have a 5G here. So this is still on hold at the moment, but we are seeing Huawei cameras or smart surveillance cameras mushrooming every time after the protests in Serbia. When it comes to the region and especially Albania, what are your thoughts and recommendations? What can be actually done to protect citizens or different social groups? The groups you mentioned from online violence, but not only online violence, from that leaking of personal private information, from data stealing and other threats.
First of all, I'd say we need to build more comprehensive data collection systems, since we are lacking these data collection systems that regarding these violations and incidents. And these systems should include information on the groups that are targeted and information on motives, so they can inform decision making and actually provide a clear picture of the gravity of violations, because this is currently lacking, as I said, particularly in the criminal justice system. A legal framework needs to be brought up to date and try to address as much as possible these areas or space for arbitrarity, particularly when certain rights are in conflict. Let's say hate speech and freedom of expression. On the other hand, where is the line? And then freedom of expression and misinformation, disinformation, the line between those as well, or addressing strategic lawsuits against public participation, which are also, or the so-known SLAPs, which are also becoming even more popular, let's call it, and they're not addressed in any of our legal frameworks as such. Of course, laws cannot address every situation, but avoid these gaps as much as possible, and then make sure that law enforcement agencies, judges, prosecutors are well trained and well aware of the need to treat these rights equally, both online and offline, so these can be applied in practice. Parliamentary oversight needs to be strengthened to ensure more accountability. Private sector accountability as well, because in many cases, private companies are subcontractors of the government in delivering certain services, or maintaining systems and so on. And accountability of those companies is limited. That needs to be addressed. Increased cooperation between cybersecurity institutions and other non-public stakeholders, including civil society and academia, but also independent human rights institutions, because we've seen that these institutions treat their work as separate. Cybersecurity institutions on one hand, and independent human rights institutions on the other hand. They need to work more and better together. Address policy and institutional fragmentation as well would be another recommendation. In many cases, responsibilities are spread amongst different institutions, and it's difficult to to hold anyone accountable, and this has been the case with the leakages again. So yeah, these would be, and yes, human rights risk assessments that I mentioned earlier before introducing any sort of decision making regarding cybersecurity.
Yeah. Thank you. I would just add that at the level of the region, there is a regional agency for cybersecurity that is actually currently based in Montenegro. So in the next period of time, we can also perhaps use its capacities to strengthen government response concerning these issues you mentioned. We'll go again to the internet shutdowns, and what are your recommendations, your thoughts, how to keep not only internet on, but both how to keep public safe online, but also how to keep human rights and democracy online, how to safeguard this?
I think with everything that's going on right now, if you look at Iran, for example, with the internet blackouts that have gone hand in hand with state repression, this is the kind of thing that can spread rapidly as countries see a model and they implement some part of it. And I think internet shutdowns have been a tool of repression. There have been dozens of regional blackouts and mobile curfews and filtering. These are 3 different techniques that authorities use to cut off the internet. In order to resolve an issue like this, first of all, I think international frameworks aren't working. You look at, there's no such thing as an international rule of law. No other government can really impose its will. And I think this is seen a lot in the telecommunications space. If a country is intent on switching off its own population, it will do that. And this is really alarming. That is something that can change. I think we can start to find ways to reconnect people, whether it's through satellite, through wireless, through decentralized networks. One of our key recommendations is that internet providers, and this is both for cybersecurity and for human rights, so this is a unified recommendation, is to decentralize networks. What we don't want to see is a situation like you've been seeing a lot in the US, for example, where small internet providers are being bought up by bigger and bigger providers, and eventually you only have one internet provider left. Because if you have this kind of quasi-monopoly, then that creates a single point of failure. So in the censorship terminology, that is it's a gateway, it's a filter net that can really control people's freedom of expression during a crisis, during an election. But in a cyber sense, that is also a choke point. It's a single point of failure. So if you get attacked there, then you lose everything, game over. So decentralization is absolutely key. Increasing awareness about this, so monitoring is essential. Obviously, as a monitor, we find that the sheer act of tracking these incidents helps prevent them, because now this type of incident is watched. You can see if communities have been shut off, if they can't speak up during an election or during a protest. And I think my final recommendation would be moving beyond the old terminology of simple freedom of speech or freedom of expression. This is about protecting fundamental human rights. And the internet today has become the basis for all other human rights. So we have to start looking at internet connectivity as a fundamental right.
Good, thank you. Mr. Weber, maybe we have a minute or two to maybe conclude this panel before giving the floor to the audience to pose questions. I would like just for you to maybe briefly comment concerning the title of our panel and the main question, because what we have seen from the war on terror until today, it's more militaristic national security approach to cybersecurity that not necessarily strengthens democracy and human rights. So could be a different approach to cybersecurity actually strengthen democracy? Could more human-centric approach would actually strengthen democracy rather than having that national security and militaristic approach to cybersecurity, what we are seeing now, especially during the huge cyber warfare?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is a very good and timely question. And I think what we've seen with 9/11 and in 2001 is that a lot of technology from the military has been transferred to the civilian sector, whether that's the police or intelligence agencies. And that was a huge, huge problem because technologies that were previously used in Iraq were then used in the US, but also within Europe. So there was really kind of a those technologies were being brought here without any discussion, and then once they were here, it was really difficult to put them back into Pandora's box. And I think something similar happened now during the pandemic. A lot of surveillance and weakening of cybersecurity was justified by these states of emergency. So I think states of emergencies are really, really tough, and so we need to have even more scrutiny during these times. How we can put, again, I think how we can strengthen our security also as civil society is to make the argument that also the government itself is partly reliant on strong cybersecurity. One example is that I like to cite is end-to-end encryption. A lot of governments want to have access, backdoor access to WhatsApp, to Signal, to iMessage, and so on. And the argument they make, yeah, we can make everyone more secure and so on. But that's the wrong argument to make, because if you weaken security for police investigations, and if they can have access to WhatsApp here, that means also there will be a vulnerability in government networks, because governments also use WhatsApp and Signal and end-to-end encryption. So I think how we can push back against this is to say, hey, you rely just on the same technology as we do. And I think that's how we can really make the nexus and strengthen our security by saying, hey, we as humans all rely on strong cybersecurity. And I think that's a really, really strong argument, because until this day, the encryption debate has been going on for 20 or 30 years, or even since really, really for a long time. And governments were just not able to say, hey, we need to weaken encryption because they don't have the technical argument to make. So I think we really need to say that, okay, journalists and government officials, they all rely on similar technologies. And I think that's really a strong argument to make also in the public. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Or, okay, we have 11 minutes before the end. I will give the floor to you. Is there any question from the audience to our speakers? Yeah, one question. Could you please just introduce yourselves?
Hello, my name is Miloš Meselđija. I have a question for all speakers. I suppose that everybody remember that case about Edward Snowden and leakage of the personal data on the internet. And what is your opinion? In this moment, is the situation even worse, or something is going on the better way regarding these questions? Thank you.
Is there anyone else? No. Who would like to start?
I can give a quick dive in. I suppose Valentin will also want to say something. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Snowden leaks as an incident that involved the breaches of personal information, I think that's perhaps the wrong perspective. The idea behind those leaks was to try to shed light on government practices that may have violated human rights, or may have even broken domestic laws in the US. Now, the problem here is, I think, and the reason why that was to some degree problematic, was because there was some collateral leakage of personal information, and particularly sensitive people in the field. So while it was a breach and a leak situation, it isn't really in the same class or category as a major data breach that impacts the lives of many in the general population. So I think it's worth making that distinction when we're looking at this incident versus, say, a data breach because a company didn't secure its server or because it was hacked or was even put in a situation where it had some Bitcoin or something to make sure that that data doesn't spread further.
Valentin?
Yeah, so I would say today is worse because we also have private companies that have these similar tools to provide surveillance on a massive scale. That's really a problem. And those private companies also sell it to many governments and empower them, right? Whether it's democracies or swing states or more authoritarian states. We really see a strengthening of government capabilities. Whether it's police response, police might earlier have needed 3 minutes or so to come to a site, right? To respond. Now they need 40 seconds or so because they have a command center in the safe city because they can really come after people. Previously, people had to go through manually through facial, through data of surveillance cameras. Now they have automated tools. Previously, they had, but I think one good thing is with the Snowden revelation is that it really strengthened also global security. Previously, you would only have websites with HTTP that would allow really, really easy surveillance, and now you have HTTPS. End-to-end encryption came about after Snowden, so I think kind of this revealing of things also made things a little better. At the same time, it's much easier today for governments to surveil you because you don't have only anymore your phone, you have your smart device at home, you have your smartwatch, you have your other IoT devices. It's really, really a lot of data out there, and so I think that's why things are worse, because there's just so many attack points for journalists, for civil society, and this is a problem that we can see today, that is just so many data. If they can't access your phone, they'll have another device that they'll be able to access and find information.
Thank you. Anyone else? If there is no question, I can conclude this panel a bit earlier. I'm sure that our panelists gave you enough arguments to see how serious the use of technology is for human rights and what needs to be done to protect it, especially online. I would also use the opportunity, what is very important for us to say, that this panel was devoted in memoriam to our colleague, Maria Pavlovic, who tragically lost her life recently, last month. She was also part of the Cybersecurity network of the Western Balkans. She contributed to the study that Maggie presented, part of the results of this study that is available also online, and she was loved and she will be missed in our team in the future. Thank you very much for your time and attention. There will be a 15-minute coffee break outside the room.